Welcome back to Family Revenge Betrayal. Let's go for a ride.
Before we begin, a warm welcome to our newest subscriber, Anila Kunaparetti. We're so glad you're here and we hope you enjoy this one. I was sitting at the head of my own conference table on the 27th floor when she walked through the door in her best interview suit and looked me dead in the eyes without recognizing me. My younger sister, the one my mother had spent 20 years introducing as the daughter who actually amounted to something. She was here to interview for a senior position at my company, the company nobody in my family knew I owned. And in the 3 seconds before recognition arrived on her face, I understood that everything I had built in silence was about to speak at full volume. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type interested in the comments, and I will give you a heart. My name is Monica Tran, and I want to start by telling you something that took me 38 years to fully understand, which is that the most dangerous thing a family can do to one of its members is not cruelty in the obvious sense, not shouting or hitting or the dramatic ruptures that leave visible marks, but the quieter and more sustained practice of deciding who a person is before that person has had the chance to find out for themselves, and then defending that decision against all available evidence for as long as the family remains intact enough to keep defending it. My family made their decision about me early, enforced it consistently, and would have maintained it indefinitely if my sister had not walked into my conference room on a Tuesday morning in September looking for a job at a company none of them knew I owned. I am the founder and CEO of Crestview Analytics, a data strategy firm headquartered in a tower in downtown Baton Rouge with my name on the lease and a view of the Mississippi River from the 27th floor that I chose deliberately, not for the aesthetics. Though the aesthetics are considerable, but because I grew up in this city being told I was going nowhere and I wanted to be able to look out at it every morning from a height, that made that verdict feel like what it always was, which is someone else's story about me that I was never obligated to accept. The firm has 340 employees, a client roster that includes 14 Fortune 100 companies, and a reputation in the industry that travels under my professional alias, M. Ree, a name that has appeared on the cover of Wired magazine and been cited in congressional testimony about data infrastructure and been spoken in rooms full of people who had absolutely no idea that M. Ree was Monica Tran, the woman her family described at barbecues as someone still figuring it out. I built Crestview from a cramped apartment on the east side of Baton Rouge 13 years ago with a used laptop, a secondhand coffee pot, and the specific focused energy of a person who has been underestimated so thoroughly and for so long that the underestimation has become a form of fuel. I did not tell my family what I was building, not because I was ashamed of it or uncertain of it, but because I had learned through years of offering things to people who only knew how to diminish them, that some things need to be built in silence, that the act of announcing a dream in a room that does not believe in you is not courage, but vulnerability without a container, and I had used up all my available vulnerability on a family that had no idea what to do with it. Let me tell you about the Tran family of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, because they are not villains, and I need you to understand that clearly, because the story I am telling you would be easier if they were, and it would also be less true. My parents, Gerald and Donna Tran, came up the way a lot of families in their generation came up, through work and church and the conviction that success was legible, which meant it looked like specific things, a certain kind of degree from a certain kind of school, a certain kind of job title that other people at church could nod at, a certain kind of life that confirmed to the people around them that they had done what parents are supposed to do, which is produce children who were visibly doing well. They were not people who had a framework for success that did not announce itself, who understood that a person could be building something real and significant in the space between the things they were being dismissed for. They loved me in the way of people whose love is genuine and whose imagination is limited. And the combination of those two things is a particular kind of difficult to navigate, because the love makes you stay in the room and the imagination makes the room feel like a ceiling. My sister Felicia is 3 years younger than me, and she was, from approximately the age of 12, the family's primary investment in legibility. Felicia was not unkind. I want to be precise about that too. She was not a calculating villain constructing a campaign against me. She was simply a person who had been handed a role, the role of the one who was doing it right, and who had accepted that role so completely and for so long that she had stopped being able to see it as a role and had come to experience it as simply who she was. She collected credentials the way some people collect furniture, not because each piece was specifically needed, but because the accumulation was the point, the visible mass of it, the way it looked in the room. The Columbia MBA was the latest addition, and at the Labor Day cookout 3 days before the interview, she wore it the way she wore the Chanel blazer, as a statement of arrival, as evidence that the family's faith in her had been correctly placed, and that the family's assessment of me, by contrast, had also been correctly placed. Let me stop here for just a moment, because this story has been reaching people all over the world, and I genuinely want to know where you are sitting right now as you hear this. What city, what state, what country, what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments, because the geography of who this finds matters to me, and I promise I read every single one. The Labor Day cookout was in my parents' backyard in the Broadmoor neighborhood, the same backyard where I had spent my childhood watching my father tend the smoker with the focused attention he rarely brought to conversations about my life. The same magnolia tree in the corner with the roots that had been lifting the patio stones for 15 years and that nobody had gotten around to addressing, because addressing it would have required acknowledging it was a problem, which is, I have come to understand, a metaphor so precise it almost feels constructed. Hickory smoke and sausage in the humid afternoon air, kids chasing each other across the grass, my uncles arguing about LSU football with the conviction of men who have assigned life or death stakes to a game, and my mother's voice carrying over the buzz of the bug zapper with the particular projection of a woman who has learned that announcements require volume to land correctly. Felicia just wrapped up her MBA at Columbia. She said, to no one specifically and everyone in earshot, which was the intended audience. She's been interviewing with some real powerhouses. Amazon, Bain, even Tesla. The way she said it, with the specific brightness of a woman reporting on an investment that is performing above projections, told me everything about how my mother understood her children, which was as extensions of her own narrative rather than as separate people with their own. And that Felicia's credentials were not simply Felicia's accomplishments, but Donna Tran's evidence that she had done something right. I took a slow sip of my sweet tea and waited, because I knew what came next, the way you know the words to a song you have heard so many times you have stopped consciously registering that you are hearing it. And meanwhile, she said, with the practiced sigh that contained 20 years of curated disappointment, someone's still doing whatever it is she does. Right, Monica? I smiled, faintly, unfazed. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a reminder about tomorrow's final merger approval, which would add $230 million in enterprise value to a firm that my mother had just summarized as whatever it is she does. My father turned a slab of brisket on the smoker and called across the yard, still messing around with that tech thing? Data dashboards or something. He chuckled, not cruelly, the way people chuckle at things they have already categorized as harmless. I glanced at my phone screen and confirmed the 10 a.m. appointment that would change Crestview's trajectory for the next decade. And I said something like that, with the shrug I had been using for 13 years to keep the ceiling from landing on things that deserved more than whatever room my family had available for them. That was when Felicia set down her mimosa with the particular deliberateness of someone about to make an announcement that has been prepared in advance, and said, with the brightness of someone who had been waiting for the right moment all afternoon, that she had an interview tomorrow. With Crestview Analytics. They called her directly. She said it was one of the top data strategy firms in the country. She said the CEO was personally sitting in on final interviews. Some woman, she said, goes by Ree. Nobody even knows who she really is. But whoever she is, she's going to love me. Applause from Aunt Cheryl. A mimosa handed across. My Uncle Dennis nodding with the admiration of a man who had just been given a data point that confirmed his existing view of how the world worked, which was that the people who succeeded were the people who were supposed to, and Felicia had always been supposed to. My father gave a satisfied grunt at the smoker. My mother looked at me with the expression she wore when the comparison was implicit, and therefore more efficient than saying it directly. I said, "What role are you interviewing for?" In the tone I use in board meetings when I already know the answer to a question and am asking it to see what the person across the table understands about their own position. Senior strategy consultant, Felicia said. Practically executive tier. And then she tilted her head at me with the practiced kindness of someone performing generosity for an audience and said, "If I get the job, maybe I can put in a word for you, Monica. I'm sure they've got admin openings you could grow into." My mother raised her wine glass. "That's sweet, honey. Lord knows your sister could use a nudge in the right direction." I looked at them both across the yard, across the smoke and the laughter and the 20 years of a story they had been telling about me without my participation, and I thought about the brushed steel nameplate on my desk on the 27th floor. Ree, Chief Executive Officer, Crestview Analytics, and I said, "That's generous of you." Voice as smooth as the Mississippi on a still morning. "Best of luck tomorrow." Felicia said, "Some of us create our own luck. Sis, you should try it." And the conversation moved on to my cousin's new boat and my aunt's bridge tournament, and I let it wash over me, and I stood at the edge of it the way I had always stood at the edge of it, apparently peripheral, actually watching, apparently small, actually the entire reason any of what was coming was possible. Tomorrow, I thought, driving out of the driveway in my nondescript gray SUV. The same one I always brought to family functions, my real car sitting in the downtown garage untouched. Tomorrow, everything shifts, and I wanted to remember exactly what they looked like before the mask fell, because the mask falling is the part that changes people, and I needed to know who they were before it did. If you have ever built something real while the people around you were busy deciding you were going nowhere, type "I know this role" in the comments, because what happened at 9:57 the following morning, when my sister walked through my office door and saw my name on the desk, is something I have thought about every day since, and I am going to tell you every detail of it, starting with the moment her face changed. I was at my desk by 6:30 the following morning. The way I am every morning that matters, which is most of them, because the discipline of early hours is not something I perform for anyone, but something I developed in the years when nobody was watching, and it became the rhythm my best work moves to. The Mississippi was doing what it always does at that hour, which is exist with the total indifference of something that has been here longer than every ambition and every disappointment in its vicinity. And I found that indifference settling in the specific way it does when you are about to do something that has been a long time coming and you need the world to remind you that it will continue regardless of the outcome. My slate gray suit was pressed. My executive assistant Jade had the folder on my desk before I had finished my first coffee. Felicia Tran, external candidate, senior strategy consultant, final interview round. I opened it and read it the way I read every personnel document, completely and without skipping, because I have learned that the details you skip are always the ones that matter later. The resume was impressive in the way that resumes built on borrowed infrastructure are impressive, which is to say it was visually convincing before you knew where to look, and once you knew where to look, it told a different story. The Columbia MBA was real, and the grade point average was legitimate, and the coursework was solid. But the internships listed beneath it, the ones with the titles that implied competitive selection and meritocratic placement, I recognized 3 of the 4 companies by their connection to my Uncle Charles, who had been running a loose network of small business relationships in the greater Baton Rouge area for 30 years, and who thought of career placement the way he thought of everything else in the family, as something you arrange for the people you were supposed to be loyal to rather. than something you competed for on an open field. The glowing references were family friends or friends of family friends, people who had known Felicia since she was a girl in church dresses, and who wrote their recommendations with the warm imprecision of people vouching for a person rather than evaluating a professional. None of this made Felicia dishonest. It made her the product of a system that had been constructed around her without her full awareness, the same way the Sunday dinner applause and the mimosa handoffs and my mother's announcements had been constructed around her, a scaffolding so thorough and so long-standing that Felicia had likely stopped being able to see it as scaffolding and had come to experience it as simply the shape of her own merit. Jade told me she had posted on LinkedIn that morning, manifesting my future as a Crestview exec under the hashtag Women in Leadership, and the post was gaining traction, which told me the professional persona Felicia had been building was as carefully managed as the resume, a public-facing story of arrival that was running slightly ahead of the actual arrival, the way confident people sometimes let the announcement do the work they are still completing. Marketing had flagged it. I told Jade it was fine and meant it, because the post was not my problem to manage, and the interview process would do what interview processes are designed to do when they are conducted by people who know what they are looking for and are not operating under the influence of family loyalty. I briefed 3 senior partners that morning, not about Felicia's connection to me, which I kept to myself for reasons I want to explain precisely, but about the depth of questioning I wanted applied to this particular candidate's experience claims. I told them to probe every title, challenge every narrative, and ask the follow-up questions that polished candidates rely on people not asking. The questions about what specifically they did rather than what the role was called, about the decisions they made rather than the ones they observed, about the failures they had navigated rather than the victories they had framed. I told them quality assurance. I did not tell them she was my sister because her connection to me was not a reason to treat her differently in either direction, and because I needed the assessment to be clean, untouched by the specific distortion that family introduces into every evaluation it is allowed to enter. I watched from behind the one-way glass of the observation suite for 2 hours. I want to tell you what I saw with the precision it deserves, because this is not the part of the story where I describe a villain failing. It is the part where I describe a person encountering the gap between the story they have been told about themselves and the reality of the room they are actually in. And that encounter, regardless of who is experiencing it, has a particular quality that I recognize from the inside, and that watching from the outside did not make easier to see. Felicia walked into the first interview with the ease of someone who had been told their whole life that walking into rooms was something they did well. And for approximately 20 minutes, that ease carried her, because ease is a form of first impression, and first impressions have a momentum that takes time to exhaust. But the partners were doing what I had asked them to do, which was to follow the thread behind every answer rather than accepting the answer at face value. And by the 40-minute mark, the ease had started to cost her more than it was giving her. The second interview was harder. She arrived at it having spent the first one working harder than she had planned to and not having gotten the response she had expected. And the recalibration showed in the slight tension at her jaw and the way her prepared stories had started to run slightly ahead of her actual delivery. The way they do when a person is monitoring their own performance in real time, rather than simply responding from experience. By the third interview, her answers had the specific compression of someone rationing material, someone who has realized they brought a finite supply to a room that was asking for more than they packed. Her voice still had its training, and her posture still had its presentation, but the certainty behind both had started to thin in the way of paint on a surface that has been too many coats deep for too many years, and the thinning was visible to anyone who knew what they were seeing. At 9:57, I told Jade to send her in. I had my back to the door when she entered, facing the window, because I wanted the first thing she saw to be the room, rather than my face, because the room was itself a form of information that I needed her to have before she had my face to organize it around. I heard her footsteps pause just inside the door. The particular pause of someone encountering a space that exceeds their expectation of it. The panoramic windows and the Mississippi below them, and the abstract oil painting behind my desk, and the Forbes cover framed on the wall with the headline she would not yet have processed, and the nameplate on the desk that she would not have been able to read from the door. I heard her compose herself and take her seat and cross her legs and fold her hands, the physical vocabulary of a woman who had rehearsed this moment many times and was executing the rehearsal. She said, "Thank you for taking the time, Miss Ree. I know how valuable your schedule must be." And I turned my chair slowly to face her, and I let the silence do the first part of the work, because silence in a room where someone is expecting to perform is the most clarifying instrument available. And then I said, "Actually, it's Miss Ree. Monica Tran Ree." The color left her face in the specific sequence of someone receiving information that their body processes before their mind has found a category for it. She looked at the nameplate, and I watched her read it and look back at me and look at the Forbes cover and look back at me, and her mouth opened and produced nothing. The specific blankness of a person whose prepared material has just become completely inapplicable. "You," she breathed. "Hello, Felicia," I said, in the same calm tone I used for every meeting that matters, which is all of them. She said, "But that can't be. You're just a remote freelancer. That's what Mom always said." And I heard in those words not cruelty exactly, but something that was in certain ways harder to receive than cruelty would have been, which was the precise and unedited summary of what my family had been saying about me in rooms I was not in. The reduction of 13 years of disciplined work to the phrase that Mom always said. As though my mother's assessment were a fact of the world rather than a failure of attention. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I gestured to the shelves where the awards were, and I said, "While you were collecting degrees, I was collecting contracts. While you announced job offers, I was building a client base." Every time someone at that table called me a failure, I was in this office negotiating with Fortune 100 companies. And I said it without heat, as information, as the factual record of a parallel life that had been running unobserved alongside the life my family had been narrating about me. And I watched her hear it. And I watched the specific expression that crosses a person's face when they understand that the story they have been living inside has a room they did not know about, and that the room is larger than the story. She said, "You tricked us." And I said, "No. Felicia, you tricked yourselves. You were so certain you knew what I was that you never once stopped to ask what I was actually building." And that sentence, I want to be honest with you, did not feel like victory when I said it. It felt like the truth arriving at the place it had been trying to reach for 13 years. And the arriving was not triumphant. It was simply true. And truth at that level of compression has a weight that neither the person saying it nor the person receiving it fully absorbs in the moment. The interview panel's assessments were already on my desk before I told her that 3 senior partners had independently recommended against hiring her, that the feedback had been unanimous, arrogant, underprepared, shallow in execution despite surface confidence, and that the decision had been made by people who had no knowledge of her connection to me and therefore no motive to shade it in any direction. She said, "You set me up," and I said, "I gave you exactly what you applied for, a chance to prove yourself on the same terms as every other candidate, and I happened to be on the other side of the table." She rose unsteadily in the expensive heels and the Chanel blazer that had entered the building as a crown and was leaving it as something else. And I watched her walk to the door, and I said, "You should look for something that fits what you actually have, Felicia," not what the scaffolding suggested. And the door clicked shut behind her, and I heard her voice crack in the hallway. And I sat alone in my office with the Mississippi below me and the awards on the shelves and the truth on the table, and the phone already buzzing with the first incoming text from my mother. And I turned the phone face down and looked out the window and understood that what was coming next from my family was not going to be an apology. It was going to be the thing that people do when the story they have been comfortable inside is suddenly no longer available to them. which is to defend the story by any means that remain, and I had 13 years of silence stored up, and I was going to need every bit of it. They didn't want the truth of what I had built. They wanted the comfort of what they had decided. And what was coming next was the moment that comfort ran out entirely. If you have ever been reduced to a phrase that someone else decided about you and carried the real version of yourself quietly in rooms they never visited, type "I carried IT" in the comments, because what my family did in the 72 hours after Felicia walked out of my office is the part of this story that reveals who they really were when the comfort of their version was no longer available to protect them. The text from my mother arrived in the sequence that told me everything I needed to know about the order in which she had processed the information, which is to say that the order was not what you might expect if you believed that a mother's first response to learning her daughter had built something extraordinary would be pride, or wonder, or even simple curiosity about how it had happened. The first text came at 11:14 that morning, 47 minutes after Jade had escorted Felicia out through the lobby. And it said, "What kind of cruel stunt was that? Felicia is in tears, and I want you to sit with that for a moment, not the anger in it, which I expected, but the framing of it, which told me that in the 47 minutes between Felicia leaving my building and my mother's thumbs finding her phone screen, the story had already been organized, the information had already been categorized, and the category it had been placed in was not Monica built something extraordinary that we completely miss, but Monica did something to Felicia, which is a fundamentally different story about what had just happened and which required ignoring completely and deliberately the central fact of the morning, which was that a woman my family had been calling a failure for 13 years was sitting in a penthouse office above the Mississippi River with her name on the building. My father's text came 4 minutes later, and it said, "How could you humiliate your sister? We didn't raise you to be vindictive." And I read that word, vindictive, and I set my phone down on the desk and looked out the window for a moment and thought about what it means when the revelation of a person's success is categorized as an act of aggression against the people who missed it, because that is what vindictive means in this context. It means you had information and you used it, and the using of it was itself the offense, which is a remarkable position to take, but not a surprising one when you understand how deeply invested my family was in the story they had been telling. Because a story that has been told for 13 years and that organizes a family's entire understanding of itself requires a very large revision. If the central character of its failure section turns out to have been building a billion-dollar firm in the same years, they were calling her directionless. I sent one message to the family group chat. I typed it carefully and read it twice before sending because I had learned long ago that precision matters more than volume, that a sentence composed with care lands differently than one composed in the heat of whatever is moving through you. And what I sent was this: "You raised me to be successful. Congratulations, you did. Now maybe you will recognize what real achievement looks like." Then I powered off my phone, turned back to my desk, and spent the rest of the afternoon doing what I had been doing for 13 years, which was running the company. But here's what I want to tell you about that afternoon and the days that followed, because I think the version of this story that is most useful to you is not the version where I close the phone and feel nothing, but the version where I tell you what I actually felt, which was not triumph, not vindication, not the clean, satisfying arrival of justice that a certain kind of story would require at this moment. What I felt sitting in my penthouse office with the phone powered off and the Mississippi below me and the company humming around me in all its built and documented reality was a specific and complicated grief that I had not expected, and that I want to name precisely because I think some of you know exactly what it feels like and have not yet had language for it. It was the grief of a person who has just definitively confirmed something they already knew, which is that the people they most needed to see them were never, in any version of the available future, going to see them in the way that needed seeing. Not because the evidence was insufficient, the evidence was now irrefutable, but because the seeing would have required them to revise a story that was more important to their sense of themselves than any truth about me could be. My mother needed to be the mother of the daughter who succeeded, and Felicia had been cast in that role before either of them had a choice about it. And the casting was so old and so structural that even a Forbes cover and a 27th floor office and 340 employees was not going to rewrite it overnight. I knew this. I had known it for years. Knowing it did not make the confirmation painless. I want to take you back now because you deserve the full picture, back to the years between the apartment with the used laptop and the morning my sister sat down across from me without recognizing my face, because those years are where the Real story lived and where the real decisions were made. And because I think the version of this story that gets told most often skips the middle part. The long, unglamorous middle part where there is no reveal coming and no confirmation on the horizon. And the only thing between you and the available comfort of giving up is the discipline you have built for yourself in the absence of anyone else willing to build it for you. I started Crestview Analytics in a 700 square foot apartment in the Broadmoor neighborhood of Baton Rouge in the same year my sister started her undergraduate degree at Tulane, which meant that the family's two trajectories had diverged in ways that were visible even then. Felicia moving along the approved path of institutions and credentials and the social proof that comes with them, and me moving along something that had no approved path and no social proof and no external confirmation that it was a path at all, rather than exactly the extended detour my family was already beginning to characterize it as. I had a business analytics background from Louisiana State that nobody in my family talked about the way they talked about Felicia's degrees, because LSU was local and practical and unglamorous. And the degree was in something technical that did not translate easily into the kind of conversation my mother wanted to have at her garden club. And I had 3 years of corporate data work at a consulting firm in Houston that I had left because I saw, with the specific clarity of someone who has been studying systems long enough to read them, that the most valuable thing I had learned in those 3 years was not the firm's methodology, but the gap between what companies were paying for and what was actually available in the market. And that gap was a door, and I had decided to walk through it. The first 2 years were the kind of years that do not make good television, but that are the actual substance of how things get built, which is to say they were mostly just work, the specific patient accumulating work of building a client base one relationship at a time, of producing results that were better than what the client had been getting elsewhere, of asking for referrals with the directness of someone who understands that a business that does not ask for its next opportunity is a business that is waiting rather than growing, and of reinvesting every dollar that came in before it had a chance to become comfort. I worked from that apartment for 16 months before I rented a small office on the 3rd floor of a building on Government Street, and I hired my first employee, a data analyst named Jerome, who had been 3 years behind me at LSU and who was underemployed at a marketing agency and who turned out to be one of the best hires I have ever made, not because of his technical skills, which were excellent, but because of his absolute refusal to accept a result that was close when inaccurate. Result was still achievable, which is the quality I look for first in everyone I hire and that no credential reliably predicts. At family dinners during those years, when they happened, and I kept going to them longer than I probably should have because the human appetite for belonging is not rational and does not always respond to the evidence available. I was the one doing whatever it is she does, the one with the tech thing, the one still figuring it out, the one my mother's voice dropped a register to describe after the pause that set me apart from whatever she had just finished saying about Felicia. I had developed during this period a practice that I want to describe carefully because I think it is the most important thing I did during those years that had nothing to do with the business, which was the practice of not arguing with the story. Not because I had accepted it, I want to be clear about that, not because I believed it or was comfortable inside it, but because I had understood something that took me a long time to understand, which is that arguing with a story in the room where the story was created only strengthens the story. That the energy you spend defending yourself in a room that has already decided about you is energy you are not spending on the thing that will eventually make the room irrelevant. And that the most effective response to being underestimated is not a speech, but a building, not a rebuttal, but a result, not a performance of worthiness, but the accumulation of evidence so complete and so documented that it eventually speaks in a register the room cannot dismiss. I adopted the alias M, in the 6th year, not to hide, but to separate, to create a professional identity that could move through the industry on its own terms without the weight of the personal narrative that Monica Tran carried in certain rooms. And it worked in the specific way of things that work quietly, accumulating recognition in circles that had no connection to my family story about me, building a reputation that traveled by the quality of the work and the specificity of the results rather than by the social infrastructure that Felicia's career had been running on, and arriving eventually at the covers of magazines and the floors of conference rooms where senators asked questions and the minds of clients who ran companies that moved markets. Crestview grew in the years the way things grow when they are being built from the inside rather than announced from the outside, steadily, specifically, in ways that compounded rather than spiked, reaching 50 employees in year 4 and 120 in year 7 and 280 in year 10 and 340 by the morning my sister sat in the lobby 30 minutes early manifesting her future as a Crestview exec. The tower on the downtown waterfront happened in year 9, when the lease on the Government Street office had run out and the firm size had exceeded what the building could accommodate, and I signed the papers for the space on the 27th floor of the Crestview Tower, which I had named for the company rather than for myself, because I have always believed that an institution worth building should eventually be larger than any individual's ego, including mine. During those years, I attended the family functions that were unavoidable and skipped the ones that were not. And I drove the gray SUV to everyone I attended and left the Mercedes in the downtown garage. Not because I was ashamed of it, but because I had made a decision early that my family would see what I had built when the building was complete enough to be seen on its own terms. And until then, I was not interested in the partial revelation that would have produced only more of what the partial information had always produced, which was their explanation for how the visible part fit into the story they had already decided was true. My mother would have found a way to minimize a nicer car. She would have found a way to minimize the office on Government Street. She would have found a way to minimize almost anything I showed her before the thing I was building was too large and too documented and too publicly confirmed to be minimized. Because minimizing me was not something she did occasionally. It was something she did structurally. It was part of the architecture of how our family worked. And you do not dismantle a structural element with a single piece of contradictory evidence. There was one night in year 7 that I want to tell you about because I think honesty requires it, and because I have come to believe that the moments of genuine doubt are as important to tell as the moments of clarity, and this was a moment of genuine doubt. I was in my office late on a Wednesday, the kind of late where the building has gone quiet around you and the city outside the window has shifted from its daytime density to its nighttime honesty. And I had just come off a phone call with a client who had decided to go in a different direction after 8 months of work that I had invested significantly in. And the financial hit was manageable, but the professional sting of it was not nothing. And I sat at my desk with the Mississippi below me. And I thought, with the specific cold clarity of very late nights, what if they are right? Not in the way of someone considering a serious argument, but in the way of a person whose defenses have been lowered by exhaustion and who is hearing the old voices in the temporary silence where the certainty usually lives. What if the thing I am building is not what I believe it to be? What if the distance between what I can see and what is actually there is not the distance between my family's understanding and my reality, but the distance between my ambition and what is possible for me? I sat with that for maybe 20 minutes, and then I opened the client roster on my screen and I read it from the beginning, company by company, result by result, year by year. And by the time I reached the current page, the doubt had gone back to wherever it lived. Not because I had defeated it, but because the record had answered it, and the record was the thing I had been building all along, and the record was sound. The pattern interrupt came 18 months before the Labor Day cookout, when the Forbes profile request arrived through my publicist, who I had retained for the firm rather than for myself, and who brought it to me as a business opportunity rather than a personal one. A feature piece on Ree, the woman who had been reshaping data strategy for a decade without most of the industry knowing who she actually was. I said yes, not because I needed the recognition. I had stopped needing recognition from external sources somewhere in year 5 and had replaced it with the internal standard of the work, but because I understood that the profile, when it ran, would be the form in which the truth arrived at my family in a way that could not be rerouted through their existing story. It would arrive as a fact of public record, confirmed by an institution they respected, in a format they could hold in their hands, and it would say the things that I had never been able to say in that backyard under the magnolia tree in a way that would actually be heard, not because I was saying them, but because the world was. The profile was scheduled to run 3 months after the Labor Day cookout. I knew it was coming. I knew what it would say. I attended that barbecue with the specific patience of a person who can see the end of a long road and is walking the last stretch of it with the same discipline they brought to the first. And I sat under that magnolia tree and I listened to my mother describe me as whatever it is she does. And I listened to Felicia announce her interview at my firm. And I smiled and I said, best of luck tomorrow. And I meant it in a way that was more complicated and more honest than it sounded, because I genuinely was not looking for her to fail. I was looking for the truth to be visible. And the truth was going to be visible regardless of what Felicia did in that conference room. Because in 3 months, a magazine was going to land on every important doorstep in America with my face on the cover and my real name underneath it. And the backyard under the magnolia tree was going to look very different from the 27th floor on that particular morning. If you appreciate stories about the long disciplined middle, the part between the beginning and the reveal where the work is just work and the validation is just the record, and the family is still telling their version, and you are still building anyway, subscribe. Because what happened when the Forbes issue hit and I had 10 copies express mailed to my family's homes, and what my mother said when she opened hers, and what my father did when he read the final line, and what Felicia posted and then deleted within 4 hours, is the part of this story that I have never told in its full sequence. And it is the part that tells you the most about who these people actually were and what recognition cost the people who withheld it longest. I want to ask you something before we get there, because this story is finding people in corners of the world I never imagined, and I want to know who you are in it. Are you the one who is still in the middle, still building in the silence, still attending the barbecues with the gray SUV while the real car stays in the garage? Or are you the one who has already had the reveal and is sitting with the complicated feeling that comes after it? Drop it in the comments, because the middle part is where most of us live and it is the least talked about, and I think it deserves more room than it gets in the stories we tell about success. The Forbes issue went to print on a Thursday. The courier delivered the express packages to my family's homes on a Friday morning. I tracked every delivery confirmation from my desk in the tower, and when the last one pinged, I set my phone down and looked at the Mississippi and thought about my mother opening the package and finding no card, no note, no explanation, just the magazine with my face centered on the cover in full color, the Baton Rouge skyline behind me, sharp suit, no alias, just Monica Tran Ree in complete and documented and publicly confirmed view. I thought about the moment the recognition arrived on her face and what it would do to the story she had been telling. And I thought about my father at the smoker with the beer in his hand, asking about data dashboards or something. And I thought about Felicia's mimosa and the word manifesting and the way she had said some of us create our own luck. Sis, you should try it. And then my phone started buzzing and I looked at the screen and it was my mother calling, and I let it ring and watched the call end and the next one start, and I understood that what was coming was not an apology. Apologies require a revision of self that does not happen in a morning, but some version of a response to finally seeing something that had been in plain sight for 13 years. And I was going to let it come at its own pace because I had waited this long, and the patience was not a burden anymore. It was just the way I moved through the world, steadily, specifically in the direction I had chosen a long time ago, in a cramped apartment with a used laptop and a secondhand coffee pot, and not a single person in my family who believed I was building anything worth seeing. If you are still in the middle, still building while someone in your life has decided your story for you, type "still building" in the comments, because what my mother said when I finally answered the phone, and what my father said in the message he left that I did not hear until 3 days later, and the one thing Felicia did that I did not expect, is the part that changed what resolution was going to look like for me. And it is coming in full detail. My mother called 4 times before I answered. Not because I was avoiding her, or not only because of that, but because I understood that the first call would be the one she made from inside the shock. The one where the words would be whatever the shock produced rather than anything she had actually decided to say. And I had learned long ago that conversations held inside other people's shock are not conversations. They are weather events. And you do not have a productive exchange with a weather event. You wait for it to pass, and then you talk about what it left behind. By the 4th call, 40 minutes after the first, the shock had had enough time to begin organizing itself into something more coherent, and I answered. She said my name the way she used to say it when I was a child, and had done something she could not yet categorize. Not angry exactly, but with the specific unsteadiness of someone whose framework for a situation has just been revealed as insufficient. "Monica," she said, and then nothing for a moment, and the nothing was more information than anything she could have said, because my mother was not a woman who ran out of words. She was a woman who deployed words with the confidence of someone who had always known which ones to use. And her silence told me that the magazine sitting open on her kitchen table had done something to the available vocabulary that she had not yet recovered from. I said, "Hi, Mom," in the same tone I use for every call that matters, which is calm and present and not performing either warmth or its absence. She said, "How long?" And I said, 13 years. And she said, "And you didn't tell us?" And I said, "No." And I let the no sit there without decoration, because the no did not need decoration. It was its own complete answer. And I waited to see what she would do with it. What she did with it was go quiet again. And in that second silence, I heard something I had not heard from my mother in my adult memory, which was the sound of a woman recataloguing, going back through the years she thought she understood, and finding that the content of them was different from what she had filed them as, and that the recataloguing was not a quick process because there was a lot of material, and because the original filing had been done with such confidence that correcting it required acknowledging the confidence had been wrong, and that acknowledgement was not available quickly or without cost. Then she said, "The article says you've been giving keynotes for 3 years." And I said yes. And she said, "We saw a piece on television about a woman named M. Last spring. Your father said he wished you had her drive." And she stopped herself mid-sentence as the implication of what she had just said arrived in her own ears. And I heard her breath catch in the particular way of someone who has just accidentally told the most honest version of a story they were trying to manage. I said, "I know," gently, because it was not a moment that required anything sharper than gentleness. It was a moment that required only accuracy. She said, "Monica, I didn't know." And I said, "I know you didn't, Mom. But I want you to hear something. I didn't hide it because I was ashamed of it. I let it be quiet because I had learned that what I was building needed to be built without the weight of other people's doubt attached to it. And the doubt was not coming from strangers. It was coming from you. And I loved you too much to let it slow me down, and too honestly to pretend it wasn't there." The silence after that was the longest one, and I sat in it with her across the phone line, and I looked at the Mississippi below my window, and I thought about the kitchen table and the craft paper and the drafting pencils, and the person who taught me that everything worth making starts with understanding the structure. And I thought about what it would have meant to have had this conversation with her at 25 or 29 or 32 instead of 38. And I thought about what it had cost me to build the structure in the silence that the absence of this conversation had required. And I held all of it without letting any of it become a weapon, because that was not what I needed it to be. I needed it to be the truth, accurate and held with both hands, and I needed her to understand it without being destroyed by it, because she was still my mother and the relationship was still worth something. It was just going to be worth something different going forward than it had been before. My father's voicemail came 3 days later, and I want to tell you why 3 days matters, because my father is a man who does not pick up the phone until he has finished thinking, and Gerald Tran finishing his thinking takes the time it takes. And the 3 days told me that he had spent those days doing something genuine with the information rather than simply reacting to it, which is more than I had expected, and which I filed carefully in the place where I keep the things that are worth tending. His voicemail was 4 minutes and 17 seconds long, which is the longest message my father has left anyone in his life. I am certain of this. And it began with a story I had never heard about his own father, my grandfather, who had run a small restaurant supply business in New Orleans that nobody in the family talked about because it had never grown beyond a certain size and had been quietly characterized as a failed attempt, a noble effort that hadn't quite arrived. And my father said, quietly, that he understood now, sitting with the magazine, that his father had not failed. He had simply built something that the people around him did not have the vocabulary to recognize as success, and that he had spent his whole life watching his father be called almost but not quite, and had absorbed that framing as a fact about his father rather than a limitation of the people doing the framing. And that looking at my face on that cover, he had understood, for the first time, that he had brought that same limitation to me, and that he was sorry. He said the word sorry once, plainly, without surrounding it with explanation or qualification. And then he said, your grandfather would have loved to see this. And then the message ended. I listened to that voicemail twice, and then I sat at my desk for a while doing nothing, which is something I almost never do. And I thought about my grandfather in the restaurant supply business in New Orleans, and about the lineage of quiet builders that apparently ran through my family in a line that everyone had been too busy looking at the announced successes to notice. And I thought about what it means to be seen accurately by a parent, even late, even imperfectly, even in a 4-minute voicemail 3 days after a magazine forced the conversation. And I thought that late was not the same as never, and that 4 minutes of genuine honesty from a man who had been trained by his own family's silence was not nothing. I saved the voicemail. I have listened to it 6 times since. I will not be listening to it any more than that, because I do not want it to become something I lean on rather than something I have received and moved forward from. The Forbes profile did what I had understood it would do when I said yes to it, which was to arrive in my family's world in a form that could not be rerouted through their existing story, because the existing story had no mechanism for categorizing something that was confirmed by an institution they respected in a format they held in their hands. But it did something I had not fully anticipated, which was to arrive in the world of everyone else who had watched the Tran family interact over the years, which in a city the size of Baton Rouge meant something specific, because Baton Rouge is a city where the community circles overlap in the specific ways of southern cities, where the church directory and the school directory and the professional directory and the social directory are all different lists with a significant number of the same names on them. My mother's garden club, the one Diane had weaponized in a different story, the one where my mother had been making her announcements about Felicia for years, received the issue at the same time my mother did. My father's colleagues received it. My Uncle Dennis, who had admired him, at the Labor Day cookout and said, whoever she is, she's brilliant, received it. The community that had been the audience for the family story about me for 13 years received the correction simultaneously, which meant there was no window for my mother to manage the narrative before the narrative arrived, which I had understood when I sent the copies without a card, without a message, without the softening preamble that would have given her time to prepare a version. Felicia called me on the Saturday after the Friday delivery. Not my mother calling for Felicia, not a text, but Felicia herself, her name on my screen, and I answered because the call itself was information. The fact that she had picked up the phone directly rather than routing through our mother told me something about where she was, and I wanted to hear it. She said, "I've been sitting with this for a day." And I said, "I know it's a lot." And she said, "I've been trying to figure out what I'm supposed to feel and I can't land on one thing." And I said, "That sounds right." And she said, "Are you angry at us?" And I said, "Not anymore." And she said, "But you were." And I said, "For a long time, yes." And she said, "Why did you come to the barbecue? Why did you keep coming? Why didn't you just stop?" And I said, "Because I love my family, Felicia. I just couldn't afford to need their approval for what I was building." And those two things existed at the same time for a long time. And I made peace with the fact that they were both true. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I always told myself you were fine, that you had your thing and it was fine, because it was easier than asking questions about why it never quite added up." And I said, "I know." And she said, "That's not an excuse." And I said, "No, it isn't." And she said, "Okay." And that okay, plain and undecorated, was the most adult thing my sister had ever said to me. And I received it the way you receive things that are imperfect and genuine at the same time, which is carefully, without rushing to make it into something larger than it was. I never disappeared, I said, into the phone, not loudly, not with the theatrical weight of a prepared line, but with the plain accuracy of something I had been understanding for 13 years. I never disappeared. You just stopped looking. The silence after that was different from the silences that had come before it in all the conversations of that week, because it was not the silence of shock or recalibration or the running out of words. It was the silence of someone sitting with a true thing that they had not known how to see before and that they were now seeing. And I let it be what it was, because some silences are not problems to be solved, but spaces where something important is happening. And this was one of those, and the Mississippi outside my window was silver in the late afternoon, and the city below, it was the same city where I had grown up being called whatever it is she does. And I was 38 years old, and my name was on the building, and my face was on the cover, and my sister was on the phone sitting with the truth. And I let all of it be exactly what it was without asking it to be more. If that line found the place it was meant to find, type truth in the comments. Because what happened in the weeks that followed, what my family did and did not do with the space the truth had opened up, and the one conversation with my mother that I did not expect to have, and that changed what resolution was going to mean for me, is something I am going to tell you in full, and none of it went the way the easy version of the story would require. The weeks that followed the Forbes issue landing were not the weeks that a cleaner version of the story would write for them. And I think that is the most important thing I can tell you about what real recognition costs the people who receive it late, which is that it does not arrive and immediately reorganize everything into clarity and warmth and the retroactive correction of 20 years of misaligned relationship. It arrives and it creates a space. And what people do with that space is entirely determined by who they were before the space opened. Because a magazine does not change a person's character. It only changes the information available to them. And character is what determines what a person does with new information. Whether they move toward the truth it contains, or whether they find a way to incorporate it into the existing story with the minimum possible structural revision. My family did both of those things. Different members in different proportions, and I watched it happen with the specific attention of a woman who has spent 13 years studying systems and who understands that how a system responds to new data tells you more about the system than any period of stable operation ever could. My mother called every day for the first 2 weeks, And I want to describe those calls precisely because they were not what you might expect from a woman who had just discovered she had been profoundly wrong about her daughter for 13 years. They were not calls of apology, not primarily, and they were not calls of pure pride either, though the pride was present and was real in its way. The specific pride of a woman who had built her identity in part around the quality of her children and who was now recalibrating upward in a direction that surprised her. What the calls were primarily were calls of explanation, and the distinction between explanation and apology matters enormously, because an explanation is a story a person tells about how they arrived somewhere, and an apology is an acknowledgement that the arriving caused harm, and my mother was much more fluent in the first than the second. She explained that she had only ever wanted the best for me and had not understood what best looked like in my case. She explained that the family had worried about me, that the worrying had come from love, that love sometimes expresses itself as the pressure to conform to legible paths, because the people who love you are afraid of the illegible ones. She explained Felicia's position in the family as something that had evolved rather than been engineered, as though the seating chart changes and the Christmas cards and the mimosa handoffs had been weather rather than decisions, and I listened to every explanation with the full attention I bring to everything. And I received them for what they were, which was my mother doing the most she was currently capable of. And I did not ask her to do more than that in those calls, because asking someone to do more than they are currently capable of is not generosity. It is a form of setting them up to fail. And I had no interest in engineering failure at this stage of the relationship. What I did in the third week was have one conversation with her that I want to tell you about, because it was the one that actually moved something, not the daily explanations, but a Tuesday evening call that started the same way the others had, and shifted when I said, "Mom, I'm going to say something and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you respond." She said, "Okay." And I believed her, and I said, "I spent 13 years building something real, and I did it without your support. Not because I didn't want it, I wanted it more than I knew how to say. But because every time I came close to telling you what I was actually doing, I remembered the way the room felt when you talked about me, and I understood that the room didn't have space for what I was building yet. And so I built it in the space I had, which was outside the room, and that worked. The building worked. But the cost of it was that I spent 13 years without my mother knowing me. And I want you to understand that both of those things are true simultaneously. That I am proud of what I built, and that the way I had to build it was lonely in ways that I am still accounting for." She was quiet for long enough that I knew she was actually hearing it rather than preparing her response. And then she said, in a voice that was smaller than her usual voice and that I recognized as the voice underneath the management, "I didn't know you were lonely." And I said, "I know you didn't, Mom. That's what I'm telling you." She cried. Not the performed tears that punctuate certain family conversations for effect, but the real kind, the kind that arrive without intention and that cannot be redirected once they have started. And I sat with them on the phone, and I did not rush her, and I did not fill the space with reassurance, because reassurance in that moment would have been a kindness to her comfort at the expense of the truth I had just put in the room. And the truth needed to stay in the room long enough for her to actually be changed by it. When she was finished, she said, "I'm sorry, Monica," and she said it simply and without surrounding it with explanation. And I said, "I know." And I meant that I believed her, which was true. And I also meant that sorry and changed are different things, and that I was interested in both, but that only one of them I could accept from her and have it mean something lasting, and the other one only time could confirm. I did not say all of that. I said, "I know." And I let the rest live in my own chest where it belongs. My father came to my office 3 weeks after the voicemail. He called ahead, which was itself new. And he arrived on a Thursday morning at 9, and Jay brought him through, and I stood up when he came in the way I stand up for every person whose presence in my office I want to honor. And he walked to the window, and he looked out at the Mississippi for a long time without saying anything. And I stood beside him, and we looked at the city together, the same city we had both grown up in. And he said, "How did I miss this?" And I said, "You were looking at what?" "You expected to see Dad." And he said, "That's not an excuse." And I said, "No, it isn't." And he said, "What do you need from me now?" And that question, that specific question in that specific form, "What do you need?" asked by my father, who had never asked it before, was the thing that mattered most in all the weeks of all the calls and all the conversations. Because it was the first time in my adult life that a member of my family had asked about my need rather than their own. And I took a moment to answer it honestly rather than reflexively. I said, "I need you to know me going forward, not the version you built without asking me, the actual one. And I need that to be something we build deliberately, because it doesn't exist yet. We have to make it. And I need it to be a relationship between two adults rather than a parent and the child they misunderstood, because I am not that child anymore, and I haven't been for a long time. And I would like you to meet the person I actually am." He nodded once with the directness of a man who makes decisions by nodding at them. And he said, "I'd like that." And we did not hug, because my father and I are not people who move quickly in the physical direction of things that are emotionally large. But we stood at the window for another few minutes looking at the city, and I felt something shift between us, not into warmth exactly. Warmth was going to take time and could not be rushed, but into honesty, which is the foundation that warmth requires to be real rather than performed. And I would take that foundation and build from it at the pace the building warranted. Felicia was harder, and I want to be honest about that, because I think the version of the story that skips the hard parts about the sibling relationship does a disservice to everyone who has one, which is most people. Felicia and I spoke 4 times in the first month after the Forbes issue, and each call was better than the last in the incremental way of conversations between two people who are trying to find the actual ground of a relationship that has never been built on honest terms. And each call also had the specific difficulty of a relationship where one person has been elevated at the other's expense for so long that neither of them knows quite how to stand without the elevation in place. Felicia had lost her organizing principle, which was the role of the one who was doing it right. And without that role, she was in the process of figuring out what she actually was, separate from the story the family had built around her. And that process was not clean or quick or linear. And I did not try to rush it or manage it or make it easier than it was, because making it easier would have meant taking on the labor of her self-discovery, the way I had always been expected to absorb the labor of maintaining the family's comfort. And I was done absorbing labor that was not mine to carry. She eventually landed a project coordinator position at a branding agency across town, a real one, earned through a process that did not involve Uncle Charles or family friends or the borrowed infrastructure of a life built on scaffolding. And when she told me about it, her voice had a quality I had not heard from her before, which was the specific satisfaction of a person who has done something on their own terms and knows it and is not waiting for someone else to confirm it. And I told her I was glad, and I meant it completely, because I have never wanted Felicia to fail. I have only wanted the playing field to be accurate. And a playing field that is accurate is better for everyone on it, including the people who previously benefited from its inaccuracy. I want to pause here and speak to something directly, because I think it is the most practically important thing in this entire story for the people listening who are of a certain age and who have their own estates and their own documents and their own families arranged around assumptions that have never been examined. What happened to my family, the specific mechanism by which my mother made decisions about my career, and my father deferred to those decisions, and my sister benefited from a scaffolding built without anyone acknowledging it was scaffolding, is a version of what happens in families when the distribution of attention and assumption has never been made explicit and has therefore never been examined or corrected. I am telling you this because the legal and financial version of what I am describing, the version where one child has been absorbing family resources and the other has been invisibilized out of their fair share, is something that estate attorneys see with a regularity that should concern every parent who has not recently reviewed their documents with an independent advisor, not the advisor their most present child recommends. but someone genuinely independent who will ask the questions that proximity and loyalty tend to prevent. My mother had not updated her estate documents in 11 years. I know this because she mentioned it in one of our calls offhandedly, and I asked her directly whether she had a current will, a current healthcare proxy, a current power of attorney, and she said it was something she and my father had been meaning to address, which is the most common sentence in estate planning. And I said, I would like you to address it this year, not because of money, but because documents that do not reflect your current understanding of your family do a disservice to everyone they are supposed to protect, and I would like the documents to be accurate. She said she would call an attorney. I told her I would follow up because I am my mother's daughter and I know that follow-up is not optional when something matters. If you think stories like this end cleanly, with the Forbes cover and the office and the apologies and the phone calls and a family reassembled neatly into something better than what it was before, they rarely do. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling a version of resolution that does not account for the fact that people are complicated and that the habits of 20 years do not dissolve in 20 weeks, and that the work of building honest relationships out of the wreckage of dishonest ones is the slowest and most demanding restoration project there is, considerably harder than a Carnegie Library in the Hudson Valley, and considerably less certain in its outcome. And I am still in the middle of that work. Subscribe, because what I decided about the door, about how wide to hold it and for whom and on what terms, is the part of this story that I have been working up to since the beginning. And it is the part that I think will matter most to the people who most need to hear it. If you have ever done the work of rebuilding a relationship that was broken by other people's assumptions and found that the rebuilding was harder than the breaking, type * the work in the comments, because the last part of this story is not about the company or the cover or the office with the Mississippi view. It is about what I decided to do with the door, and every word of it is worth the wait. The Labor Day cookout the following year was held in the same backyard in Broadmoor. The same magnolia tree in the corner with the same roots still lifting the same patio stones that nobody had addressed in the year since I had last stood under it watching my family perform their certainties at each other. And the hickory smoke was the same, and the bug zapper was the same, and my uncles were arguing about LSU football with the same conviction of men who have assigned eternal stakes to a seasonal game. And on the surface, it looked enough like the previous year that a person walking into it without context would have assumed nothing had changed. But the surface was not where the changes lived. And I had spent enough years working on buildings to understand that the most significant structural changes are rarely the ones you can see from the street. They are the ones in the load-bearing elements underneath, in the redistribution of weight and the correction of the foundational issues that had been lifting the stones all along. And the Tran family backyard in Baton Rouge on Labor Day of the following year had undergone changes in its load-bearing elements that were not visible from the street, but that I could feel the moment I walked through the back gate. My mother met me at the gate, not the performative version of meeting someone at the gate, not the hostess move of a woman positioning herself at the entrance to control the first impression of the arrival, but actually at the gate, waiting, which is a different thing entirely, because waiting implies that she had been looking for me rather than receiving me. And the distinction between looking for someone and receiving them is the distinction between someone who wants you there and someone who is managing your presence. She said, "I'm glad you came." And I said, "I told you I would." And she said, "I know, but I'm glad anyway." And we walked into the yard together, which is a thing that had not happened before. My mother and I entering a family space as two people arriving together rather than as the host and the daughter she was categorizing in real time. And I noticed it the way I noticed structural details that tell me about the underlying system, as information about what had shifted and by how much. I want to be honest with you about what the year between the two Labor Day cookouts had looked like, because I have been honest about everything else in this story, and I am not going to stop being honest at the part where honesty is most complicated, which is the part about whether things actually got better and in what ways and at what cost and with what remaining limitations. The year had been a process not a transformation. And the distinction between those two words is the difference between a building that has been renovated and a building that is being restored. The renovation being a covering over of what exists, and the restoration being the slow, careful work of finding what is original and true and bringing it back to function. And what my family and I were doing was restoration, which is slower and more uncertain and more expensive in every currency than renovation, and which produces results that are less immediately impressive and more fundamentally sound. My mother and I had spoken every week, sometimes twice. The calls had evolved from the explanation calls of the first weeks into something more honest and less managed. And I want to tell you what made that evolution possible, because it did not happen by itself. It happened because I made a decision about how I was going to show up in those calls, which was fully, not the version of fully that means performing openness, but the version that means actually bringing the real content of my experience and my thinking into the room rather than managing what I shared to protect either of us from the difficulty of it. I told her things I had not told her before, not as accusations, not as the delayed delivery of grievances that had been composting for 13 years, but as information about who I was and how I had moved through the world and what the experience of being her daughter had actually been like from the inside. And I told it the way I tell everything, with precision and without embellishment. And I found that when I brought the real content, she responded to it more genuinely than she ever had to the managed version, because the managed version had not given her anything real to respond to, and she had therefore been responding to the surface, which produces surface responses, and I had been frustrated by the surface responses without understanding that I was the one keeping us there. My father and I had breakfast every third Thursday. His idea, his call, his scheduling, which told me something important about the sincerity of the effort, because a person who is performing reconciliation makes you do the scheduling and then shows up, and a person who is genuinely trying does the scheduling themselves and arrives early. And my father arrived early every time. We talked about his father, my grandfather in the restaurant supply business in New Orleans, more than I had expected, and I understood that the Forbes cover had opened something in my father that had been closed since his own father died. A grief about a man he had loved and never fully seen, and who had deserved to be seen. And that working through that grief was happening in our Thursday breakfast in a way that was making our relationship more honest than it had ever been, because we were both arriving at it through the same recognition, which was that quiet builders deserve to be known while they are still alive to be known. Felicia and I had dinner once a month at a restaurant of her choosing, which was the arrangement I had suggested, because I wanted her to have one domain of the relationship where she was setting the terms, not because I was performing generosity, but because I understood that rebuilding a sibling relationship that has been organized around one person's elevation requires the elevated person to have some experience of directing things, and that this was something Felicia needed to develop in herself, the capacity to choose without someone else providing the scaffolding. She was 4 months into the branding agency job when the dinner started, and I watched her over the monthly meals develop the specific posture of a person who is learning what their own work feels like. And the development was not linear and was not always comfortable, but it was real, and real is what I had always wanted for her. Not the success that borrowed its confidence from other people's infrastructure, but the kind that knows where it came from because she built it herself. At the Labor Day cookout, my Uncle Dennis found me near the smoker and stood beside me in the way of a man who has something to say and is deciding how to say it. And then he said it, which was, "Monica, I owe you an apology. I sat at that table and talked about him. Real like she was some stranger and you were standing right there and I didn't see you. And I should have been paying closer attention to my own family instead of looking for heroes in magazines." I looked at him and I said, "Dennis, you didn't know." And he said, "I should have asked." And I said, "Yes, you should have." And I let that stand without softening it because it was true and he was ready to hear it, and letting it stand was a form of respect for his capacity to handle truth. which is a capacity I think people deserve to have trusted rather than managed around. He nodded, and we watched the smoker for a moment in the companionable silence of two people who have said a true thing and do not need to say anything else immediately. And then he said, "Your grandfather would have been so proud." And I said, "My father told me the same thing." And Dennis said, "Oh, you knew about your grandfather." And I said, "I learned recently." And Dennis looked at me with the expression of someone who has just understood that several conversations that should have happened a long time ago are happening now. And I held his gaze and I let that be exactly what it was. My mother made an announcement that afternoon, not the kind she used to make, not the broadcasted performance of her children as evidence of her own success, but a quieter and more honest version. She gathered the family and she said she wanted to say something. And the yard went to the particular attentive quiet of a group of people who understand they are about to hear something that matters. And she said, "I want to acknowledge someone I should have been acknowledging a lot longer than I have." And she looked at me and she said, "My daughter Monica built something extraordinary, not just the company, though the company is extraordinary, but the integrity it took to build it the way she built it, quietly, without needing any of us to validate it, and I am proud of her, and I am sorry it took me this long to say that out loud in the right room." The yard was quiet in the way it is quiet when something true has just been said in a space that is not used to truth at that register. And I stood under the magnolia tree where I had stood the year before watching my family perform their certainties, and I felt the weight of what she had just done, which was not a small thing. My mother had stood in the room where the story had been told the wrong way for 20 years and corrected it in front of the same audience that had been present for the telling, and that correction cost her something. I could see the cost in the way she held herself when she finished, and I received it with the full gravity it deserved. I walked to her and I said, "Thank you, Mom," quietly, just the two of us in the noise of the yard. And she said, "I mean it." And I said, "I know you do." And then I said the thing I had been understanding for the full year of Thursday breakfasts and weekly calls and monthly dinners and the slow restoration work of a family that had been built on an inaccurate foundation and was learning what an accurate one felt like. I said, "I'm not closing the door, Mom, but I decide how wide it opens." She looked at me for a moment and then she nodded. The nod of a woman who understands what she is being told and who understands that it is not a punishment, but a fact. The same fact that my mother's irrevocable documents would have been if my mother had been the kind of woman who built legal architecture instead of social architecture. The fact that the relationship was real and was worth maintaining and was going to be maintained on the terms that I set rather than the ones that had been set for me by default for 38 years. And that this was not a closing, but an opening, a genuine one, the first genuine one. Because a door that opens on your own terms is a door you can actually walk through rather than a door you are managed toward. I want to tell you what I understand now that I did not understand at the beginning of the 13 years, because I think it is the most useful thing in this entire story, and it is the thing that most of the other versions of stories, like mine, tend not to say directly, which is that the building, the actual building, the company and the clients and the floor of the tower and the view of the Mississippi and the Forbes cover and the 340 employees, the building was never the point of the silence. The silence was not a strategy for maximizing impact or engineering a reveal or setting up the most dramatic possible moment of recognition. The silence was a survival mechanism that became a discipline, that became a practice, that became the foundation of everything I built. And the foundation is not the building. The foundation is what the building stands on, and what the building stands on is the understanding that your worth is not a function of other people's ability to see it. That the work is real whether or not anyone in the room where you grew up is capable of acknowledging it. That the most important voice in the room where you do your best work is your own, and that building the capacity to trust that voice in the absence of external confirmation is the single most valuable thing a person can do for themselves in a world that tends to confirm only the legible and the announced. My mother updated her estate documents 3 months after the Labor Day cookout. She did it with an independent attorney, a woman named Patricia Odoms, who came recommended by a colleague with no connection to our family. And she sent me a message afterward that said, "I did the thing you asked," and I read it and I replied, "I know," Patricia called me. And my mother replied, "You know, Patricia." And I replied, "I retained her for you because I wanted to make sure it got done, and I know how to make sure things get done." And my mother replied with a single laughing emoji, which is the most honest form of communication she has sent me since I was a child. And I saved the screenshot of that exchange in the same place. I keep the things that are worth tending, next to the voicemail from my father and the photograph of the Mississippi from my office window, and the first dollar I made from the first contract Crestview ever signed, which is framed on the wall of my office in the space to the left of the Forbes cover. Not because the dollar is worth framing, but because it is the beginning of the record. And I keep the beginning of the record visible so that every person who sits across from me in that office understands that the building started before the building was visible, and that what made it possible was the discipline to keep building in the silence where the visibility had not yet arrived. Crestview Analytics is expanding into Europe this year. We are onboarding 2 enterprise-level contracts that will add significantly to the firm's reach and change the nature of the work we are able to do in the industry. I am mentoring 12 early-stage founders through a program I established specifically for underrepresented people in technology who are building things in the silence where their families and their communities have not yet caught up to what they are creating. And I tell every one of them the same thing, which is not a speech and not a slogan, but just the thing I know to be true from having lived it, which is that the silence is not your enemy. The silence is the only environment in which certain things can be built, and that the people who are meant to see what you are building will see it when the building is complete, and the people who are not meant to see it will say they always knew, and that the difference between those 2 groups of people will become very clear to you in the year after the Forbes cover lands. And you will find that clarity clarifying in ways you did not expect, and that require more grace than the dramatic version of the story prepared you for. I drove to that Labor Day cookout in the white Mercedes, not to perform anything, not to make a point, not to show the family what they had missed or confirm for the neighbors what the magazine had said. I drove it because it is my car, and I was going to my family's home, and I was done arriving in a version of myself that was calibrated for their comfort rather than my own truth. And because one of the things that the year of Thursday breakfasts and weekly calls and monthly dinners had taught me was that the people who were worth the relationship were capable of receiving me accurately once I stopped managing my own presentation to protect them from the accuracy, and the people who were not worth the relationship were going to reveal that regardless of what I drove, and I was done using my own diminishment as a management strategy for other people's limitations. I parked it in the driveway next to my father's truck, and I walked through the back gate, and my mother met me at the gate, and we walked into the yard together, and the hickory smoke was the same, and the bug zapper was the same, and the magnolia tree was the same with its roots still working at the patio stones. And I looked at those stones and I thought I should have someone address that, and I found my father at the smoker, and I said, "Dad, those stones near the magnolia, the roots have been lifting them for years." And he looked at them and said, "You're right, I always meant to get to that." And I said, "I know a good contractor." And he said, "Yeah, I imagine you do." And we both laughed, a real laugh, the kind that happens between 2 people who are in the same room with the same truth at the same time. And the laugh was quiet and unannounced, and nobody in the yard noticed it. And it was the best moment of the whole afternoon. And I'm not going to explain why, because if you have been listening to this story from the beginning, you already know. This is not the end of the work. It is the end of the silence. And the difference between those 2 things is everything. The door is open. I decide how wide. And for the first time in 38 years, that decision is entirely mine. The next story begins in a courtroom in Atlanta, where a woman discovers that the business she spent 22 years building with her husband was registered entirely in his name without her knowledge, and what the attorney finds when she pulls the original incorporation documents, and what the witness on the stand says that nobody in that courtroom expected to hear, will make everything you just read feel like the quiet before a very specific and very instructive storm.